This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation. We're working at accelerated speeds to digitize and automate across pharmaceutical and medical devices. There are unique challenges inherent to emerging technologies in clinical trials development, in scale-up, and in manufacture. As we begin to harness the data delivered through AI and further refine the processes around automation, IVT Network strives to bring to light some of the most innovative products and uses for the benefit of the entire life sciences industry. So this week on Voices in Validation, we speak with Dr. Peter Small from Hyfe about an AI cough monitor that detects and records every cough and turns that into reliable clinical data. Welcome, Peter. So great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Absolutely, absolutely. Excited to dive in a little bit more on this particular technology. So without further ado, Peter, can you provide a little background about yourself and your areas of expertise within the life science community?
Yeah, well, I've had a pretty eclectic background. I started as a practicing physician in San Francisco, at San Francisco General at the dawn of the AIDS epidemic, then moved down to Stanford University, where I was on the faculty doing molecular epidemiology research, and then moved up to Seattle in 2002 as one of the early employees of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where I built and ran their tuberculosis program, and then returned back to academia at Stony Brook University. So I've moved around quite a bit, and in this eclectic, or as the tenure committee at Stanford said, in granting me tenure, somewhat diffuse career, I've had this common theme of cough, really focused primarily on the disease of tuberculosis. Before COVID, it was the single leading infectious killer, and sort of followed that thread from one exciting opportunity to the next.
Yeah, and in addition to the theme of cough, it sounds like you've always been an innovator, someone on the cutting edge of things or getting involved early. Certainly with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I'm sure you had your share of innovative solutions and programs that you worked on. But let's talk a little bit more about the cough, because, you know, the cough has been around since the dawn of time. That's not something new to any of us. So why now for a product specifically focused on the cough? Well,
you know, I actually think we're entering into what's going to be the golden era of cough. It's a confluence of a number of factors. I think first and foremost is the COVID pandemic. Mm-hmm. And you know, people have come to understand that cough is a serious sign or symptom of disease and part of what propagates respiratory pathogens. And you know, for folks like myself, in addition to studying cough, I'm also a chronic cougher. I cough and have for 30 years, about 20 to 80 times a day. And I just ignored it until the COVID epidemic came along. And it used to be when I'd cough at the grocery store checkout line, people would think that I sneezed and they say, "Oh, God bless you." Now they sort of step back and look at me like I just pulled out an Uzi submachine gun. So right. I think that we're at a point where people are much more sensitive to cough. Absolutely. I think there's also some really fundamental progress that's being made in understanding the pathogenesis of cough, and you know, chronic cough as a neural loop with receptors that can be blocked, and drugs that are before the FDA as we speak. If approved, or when approved, these will be the first new cough medicines since the early 50s. And then finally, for infectious cough, it's the realization that strange bacteria can be a cause of some of the symptoms in bronchitis and other pulmonary conditions. So all of this comes together to make, I think, this period we're entering one in which cough is becoming more noticed, more treatable, And that for us at Hyfe, it coincided with these remarkable advances that have been made in machine learning and artificial intelligence. So, and then throw on top of that the ubiquity of cell phones, and then suddenly we're at a place where, you know, now is the time to create what we consider to be a Fitbit for cough, a device that passively monitors your cough and tells you how much you're coughing and when you're doing so.
So excellent. So what can, you know, it's, as you mentioned, there's various reasons why someone might cough. Certainly we are heightened, our awareness is heightened right now because of the COVID pandemic. And whenever we hear people cough, I think we tend to have a bigger reaction than we may have had 2 years ago. But really, when you think about the cough, what can it tell us about an individual? You know, and why are we concerned with collecting data on it? I mean, you mentioned the creation of perhaps some new pharmaceuticals, but help us with that picture a little bit more, refine that picture a little bit more.
Well, first of all, I think we're finally listening to patients like myself who have chronic cough. There's no diagnostic test for cough. So when you go to your doctor and you say, I had this cough, it's been bothering me for months, they will say, well, maybe it's GERD, and give you some Pepcid and send you home on what's a therapeutic trial that's never measured. And then if you come back, they might say, oh, well, perhaps it's asthma, and they'll give you some inhalers. So you know, for individuals, the ability to understand the magnitude and severity of their cough and how it responds to either changes in their lifestyle or medication is simply game changing. I think the other thing about the cough is that it's not widely appreciated how common a symptom it is. It's one of the most common reasons that people seek medical care. And for about 5% of the United States, chronic cough of unexplained etiology that doesn't respond to those over-the-counter medicines is a persistent problem for as many as 5% of Americans. And this can be, I'm not talking about like, you know, little achy wakey every, you know, couple of times a day. I'm talking about people who cough so much that they can't go out in public. They can't go to a movie. You know, women who have stress incontinence when they cough. It's super embarrassing and stigmatizing to have a cough. And so I think that letting those people communicate with their doctors in a meaningful way. I mean, right now, when you go to a doctor with a cough, and I know because I've been on both sides of the bed here, sure, both as a provider and a patient, that, you know, the doctor will say, oh, well, how much are you coughing? And the immediate response is, I don't know, doc, how many times did you cough yesterday? And, you know, that's just, and then they'll say, well, how's it sound? You're like, I don't know, wet, dry. You take this incredibly complicated signal and reduce it to a single word. So it's, I think that this can be helpful for individuals. I think it can be helpful for health systems. And we just submitted a manuscript where we monitored cough at a population level as a data stream for epidemiology. So we do this syndromic surveillance all the time in public health, where you have people sit in an emergency room and count how many times flu-like illness comes in. Well, imagine if instead we had hundreds of thousands of volunteers around the country who were monitoring their cough on their phone, so that when there was an increase in a cough in a community, you would know. And we did this in a community in northern Spain just recently.
Yeah, I bet the results are pretty telling, right? When you can see, when you have your geographic hotspots, and you can then track if there are epidemics or outbreaks of something going on in that area, right? Talk a little bit more, if you will, about how this AI device works.
So the app, which is freely downloadable from our website, runs on either an Android or an iOS phone, and it runs in the background monitoring sound levels. And that's very important. It's not listening, right? So this is privacy preserving. It's simply monitoring the level of sound. And when there's an explosive sound, if you think back to the era when we had, those of us who are old enough to remember it, hi-fis, not Wi-Fi's in our house. There was that little volume gauge and it would go bing over into the red and bounce down. So that's all we're looking at. We're looking to say, when is there an explosive sound? When that happens, the device, the app will send a half a second of sound to the cloud. Now that's enough sound for us to distinguish if it's a cough or not, but not enough to contain any meaningful information about what you're doing or who you are or what you're saying. And that thing gets run through an algorithm which can recognize a cough, and that information gets sent back to the phone and plotted on a little histogram. This algorithm is extremely precise at this point in time. We've trained it on sounds that we've collected, and if you think about what's called the original sin of AI, which is biased data sources.
Right.
So if we were to train this just on hospitalized patients in, say, Manhattan, it would have no utility outside of that setting. So we have now collected over 180 million explosive cough-like sounds. We've actually sat and listened to over 2 million of those and used that to train the app, so that the algorithm is very sophisticated, both on the breadth and the depth of the data that it's been trained on.
It sounds like you've certainly done your due diligence on that. So I know in this app that there's a real-time tracker, and you just mentioned a little bit about how that's working and sending information to the cloud. How is that real-time tracker saving researchers, valuable time and money?
Well, it's opening up an entire new field of cough science. At this point, pretty much anything your doctor will say about cough is based on what we used to call clinical pearls. That's a euphemism for somebody made it up years ago. Now scientists can actually measure cough. So it's said that, the cough changes over the course of a day. And that's true. In general, people cough most in the evening as they lay down to go to bed, and least around 4 or 5 a.m. So we're able to bring science to things that people have been talking about for a long time. And most interesting aspect of that is that we're starting to collect massive databases of coughs whose etiology we know. And once we have a collection of, say, 500,000 tuberculosis coughs, we can train our expectation. And this is an unproven expectation, but our hope is that we can make a Shazam for cough. Shazam is what my teenagers use to recognize the old music that I sometimes play. They turn it on, and in about 3 measures, they go, "Dad, that's Grateful Dead, isn't it?" And so we're going. Our goal is to develop a Shazam for cough, and one in which these investigators who have been using it to learn about these different diseases we can now train it so that it can recognize not just that there's a cough, but also give us a hint as to what it's caused by. And as someone who's spent most of my life in global health and combating tuberculosis, if we could turn every cell phone in Africa into a diagnostic device, it would be a complete game changer. And that's really the long-term dream that gets us up in the morning.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, that would be such a step forward, especially in places where healthcare proximity to doctors is not maybe as it is in some places here in the US.
Absolutely. I was very involved when I was building and running the tuberculosis program for the Gates Foundation in a number of diagnostic technologies, which were genuinely revolutionary, the sort of the lab on a chip. The frustration was getting those devices out to where they're needed. And so, I feel like the big transformation in global health is going to come by starting with the sensor, not with the technology. And the sensor is a cell phone.
Right. Absolutely. And we know those are very widespread in most places across the globe. So And in reading this, it looks like you have many partner sites where you are doing clinical trials or have done clinical trials for this product. And trial subjects may participate remotely, as I understand it. So can you talk about why this is important to the end user?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, anybody who is interested in tracking their cough can download the app for free for either Android or iOS. That, I want to really emphasize, that's a health and fitness app. It's not licensed by the FDA and thus can only be used for your own guidance about your health and fitness.
Not an actual diagnostic tool, right?
It is not a diagnostic tool, and it's not even a disease monitoring tool at this point.
Right.
We are pursuing with the FDA a class 2 medical device approval so that it can be used by providers. So when they send you home with a Pepsi, you get to see whether or not it actually works.
Right.
And then we also have the this research app, which comes with a whole back end that allows people to investigators, and this is now all done. These latter applications are done under strict IRB approval and informed consent. Mm-hmm. Where a scientist will be studying a disease and they'll, for instance, be interested in how cough changes as patients with congestive heart failure go in and out of decompensation, or how COPD patients start to cough early and allow for early intervention. So these are the research application. And then the final is looking at cough as an endpoint in clinical trials. So it's rather remarkable right now how data presented for cough medicine doesn't actually measure people's continual cough over time. And in fact, most of them are largely based on patient-reported outcomes, which are super helpful and super important. But it's asking a different question. It's saying, is your cough bothering you? And I can tell you, as a chronic cougher, my cough goes from 20 to 80. I don't really feel or notice the difference. My patient-reported outcome would be like, yeah, just another day. But right. I'll tell you, if someone came out with a drug and they went from 80 coughs to 20 coughs reliably over time, that would be quite a significant improvement. And the cough doctors who I've talked to said, hey, I wouldn't need this if I had something I gave patients and their cough disappeared. But it never does, and people are not good at sensing subtle changes, which could be very meaningful endpoint in clinical trials. So that's sort of the scope of how we see this technology getting out there. I mean, it's a lot. I mean, we feel like we have a total tiger by the tail here.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And first things first, you gotta go through all of the trials, and then you have to do all of your applications to FDA, and I'm sure other. What is your plan for distribution for this particular product? And obviously, the app is downloadable by anyone with an Android or an iOS based cell phone. But in terms of being able to supply information back to the users, based on their cough history or things that you're able to diagnose. And I say that in quotes because you're not really at that point yet, but I imagine that is the end goal, is to be able to provide feedback back to the user. So can you talk a little bit more about the rollout of this product, like beyond the clinical trials and beyond the regulatory applications?
Yeah, so first of all, we're an early stage startup. Mm-hmm. And having spent most of my professional life in large enterprise environments like the Gates Foundation, it's quite refreshing to be working with 25 young people whose ambition is to change the way the world's approaching cough. And so I wouldn't say that we have a 10-year plan, but we definitely have this minimal value product, which we think is working quite well. I suspect that the ultimate rollout will come from our science. We're also a science first organization. So mm-hmm. First and foremost, we want to know, how well does this actually work? The analytical performance when given half-second snippets of sound is mind-blowing to this biologist. I've never seen an ROC curve like what these computer guys can generate. But we need to know, like, when you actually send this home with a patient, how often when they cough does it pick it up, and how often when it says there's a cough might it be over or under calling that. So we're spending a lot of time right now on some real fundamentals. We spent, God, I hate to say how much time on a 30-page protocol to just say, okay, how, when we're annotating the gold standard, do we define a cough? And
yeah,
because there's a cough,
there's
you put your finger on it, Stacey. The challenge is the difference between a cough and throat clearing.
Right.
Because they're very similar. In fact, one of our scientists underwent laryngoscopy so that he could see his larynx when he cleared his throat and when he coughed, to try and understand the difference. So first and foremost for us is the science of proving whether it works. Then there's the science of showing whether or not it makes a difference. We're all familiar with lots of cool things that can happen that don't really make a meaningful difference in the lives of patients, providers, and health systems. So that's the sort of the phase where we have 20 trials now, 9 different diseases all around the world. And then where it goes from there, I haven't a clue.
Fair enough. I mean, it sounds like it is very interesting and is providing a lot of insight anyway. And I think that if it can be used to sort of help pinpoint very early pandemics or very early disease outbreaks, that would be an amazing use for this tool. But, you talked a little bit about improving patient lives. And tell me a little bit more about that. How do you see over time, long-term, how this device would actually improve someone's life?
Well, I'll tell you, we're already getting feedback from a number of patients who have this refractory chronic cough. And they'll send us an email and say, I've been talking to my doctor for 5 years about my cough, and it wasn't until I showed him the plot of my 300 coughs a day that he said, wow, you've got a big problem. Why didn't you tell me about this? So I think that for people who have a cough, this is a great way for them to understand it. We have other patients that say, I didn't realize that I cough the most after a big meal. Maybe if I don't eat so much, fatty food. I mean, people
or food or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is the future of healthcare. It's owned by those who are suffering from it, and for people to take control of their own cough, to understand it, to try different interventions. I think that the self-awareness of cough for those who have a problem with cough is super helpful. I think the ability to communicate with their providers is super helpful. And I think that ultimately down the road, it's going to create this virtuous cycle where patients who have a cough will be aware of it. Doctors who are aware of it will have effective treatments. Patients and doctors will see that they're getting better. Those interventions, those new medications will sell more, and there'll be more investment in better medications. And it'll just take what has been essentially a desert and turn it into a virtuous cycle in which cough finally gets the attention that it deserves.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's got to be validating too for the users, right? Sometimes when you go to the doctor, as to your earlier point, and you go and they say, well, how often do you cough? Or what does it sound like? And you're like, I don't know. I mean, I didn't write it down, but now you can shape a lot. Because look at here, I have the evidence. And, as a cougher, then you don't have to feel like, you're defensive. You have to be defending yourself, right? Like here's the data. I mean,
well, absolutely. Absolutely. And I have, a number of friends who are pulmonologists and take care of cough. And there was an article about us last year in the Wall Street Journal, and I was quoted in the sidebar as saying that pulmonologists are like cardiologists without a blood pressure cuff. And I thought I would get hammered by all my friends, but they all said guilty as charged. They said, look, we spend way too much time trying to get information, which is almost never credible, and trying to understand and sometimes even explain to patients how much better they're feeling. I said, whoa, if you're spending much time with your patient explaining how much better they're feeling, I'm not sure you're doing the right things. That didn't get me any further in their friendship.
Yeah, that's a whole separate conversation. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges faced as you develop this new technology, whether regulatory or trial related specifically?
Yeah, I would say the biggest challenge is to get people beyond complacency about cough. There's a general sense like,
who are we talking about? People?
Everybody except us coughers. I mean, it's amazing. We'll talk to doctors and say, like, we have this way you could quantify your patient's cough. And they go like, yeah, well, I don't really care how many times they cough as long as it's not bothering them. I'm like, okay, fine. Put your head in the sand. We'll talk to, we've had conversations with scientists who say, well, I'm not sure that this kind of data would add value because I don't think cough is ever going to really be diagnostic. I'm like, okay, well, put the cart before the horse, assume it won't work and move on. We'll talk to somebody who's willing to entertain a new hypothesis. And then, in terms of the regulatory and the health systems, they're understandably very, very cautious about this approach. And that's why we're spending the time that we're spending to get the science right. But I will say that I do not feel as though regulators understand that cough is not a minor cosmetic issue, that it is a life-changing event for a subset of patients for whom they could be better served by both the pharmaceutical and the regulatory agencies.
Is it your anticipation that once you are able to deliver this data in a scientific fashion, then that will be the catalyst for drug developers and scientists in pharmaceutics to start looking at ways of helping relieve cough?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a complicated nonlinear dynamic system, but
right.
I think we can play a significant role. I mean, put yourself back 10 years and think about steps. I mean, no one was talking about steps. Exercise was something you said, well, do you exercise 3 times a week? Oh yeah, doc, I exercise, And so it was the ability to measure steps that made steps important, right. Which has then fed into so many applications for personal health, drug development, and scientific research. So I think that's the role I think that we can play. I think we can make real and objective something which is right now either subjective or completely ignored.
So, and I totally get that. That makes so much sense to me when you say, like, first we need to draw attention to the number of coughs and who's coughing and what it's all about, right? Just like the Fitbit did with steps. What opportunities then for growth and scalability do you predict within this industry? And maybe it's not just with your app, but with the entire subset of folks who would be involved in the analytics of cough.
Yeah, I'm not on the business side,
of course,
of this little startup, but
I would think you have hopes for what this might mean.
Yeah, I mean, look, my hope is that we change the world's approach to cough. Nothing short of that.
Right.
And I think the way that we will end up doing that is by being part of many, many efforts. So, Hyfe, we're cough nerds. We know more about cough than I would argue any 25 people aggregated in the world. And we're developing an app which will be an important signal for a lot of different technologies. So whether it's remote patient monitoring, so if there's a company that's bundling sensors and signals to monitor congestive heart failure I suspect that one of those signals will be, licensing our cough. The same. So I think that what we'll end up with is sort of being the Google Maps of cough. It's anyone who's interested in cough will find it easier to adopt the excellent system that we've developed than to try and collect a couple 100 million coughs and sort it out themselves.
Yeah. You will have already crossed that bridge for sure. Well, it sounds like a fascinating technology, one that we look forward to hearing updates on as you make progress with your clinical trials and work through the regulatory system there. But as we get ready to wrap up today, I just wanted to see if there's any last thoughts or ideas that you'd like to leave with our listeners.
Yeah, great question. The doctor in me just would love to speak to your listeners as patients and just to say that if any of them are suffering from chronic cough, and statistically about 1 in 20 will, that they don't have to put up with it anymore. I mean, it's kind of I was thinking about that film from the mid 70s, Network, that's I'm angry as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. So,
right.
Those of us who've coughed for decades, it's time for us to recognize that now is the time in which new drugs and new monitoring technology can allow us to get on top of it and not just live with it.
Very well said. Great way to leave our listeners. And Dr. Small, tell them if they need to reach out to you. Can you tell them how to do that?
Yeah, it's our website. If you just Google Hyfe, Hyfe, you'll get to the website. And anybody wants to reach me, it's just peter@hyfe.ai.
Fantastic. And we will include those contacts in the show notes as well.
Super.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you again, Dr. Peter Small, for being our guest today. So great to have you with us and learn about new trends and breakthrough technologies. This is the kind of technologies and apps that really are critical to the future success of life sciences. So thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great, and it's wonderful to reach out to the really smart people who are focused in the way that they are in your audience.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Also, I want to give a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And lastly, thank you to you, our valued listeners. I'm grateful for your time and your help in sharing these podcast episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to rate and review in your podcast player of choice, and be sure to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. For show notes and additional podcast information, including links and contact information for Hyfe and Dr. Peter Small, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com/podcast. We'll be back again next week with another great and insightful discussion. Until then, make it a great week.